Authors in modern science fiction have begun writing pieces that cross over into other genres of speculative fiction. This can make analysis of modern sci-fi pieces a little bit more difficult and can lead to dead ends due to these hybrid genres. However, when it comes to World War Z, An Oral History of the Zombie War by Max Brooks, it is uniquely a science fiction piece. It can be misinterpreted as a horror narrative, but this interpretation can lead the reader to a dead end, completely missing major themes and messages in the story. While the apocalyptic zombie trope seems to almost always fall under the horror genre, the way Max Brooks uses this trope when he writes his story, it simply acts as a catalyst for his narrative, which fits World War Z into only the science fiction genre. Now, one thing must be made clear to you, the viewer, before I proceed to my argument. When I refer to World War Z, I'm referring to the book written by Max Brooks and published in 2006, and not the film by Mark Foster from 2013. Though the film was very excellent, it doesn't have much to do with the book. It simply uses the same setting that Max Brooks wrote about in his book. World War Z, An Oral History of the Zombie War, takes place in the not-so-distant future, 12 years after VA Day in the United States and only 10 years after Victory in China Day. Both of these days representing the end of the zombie war for both of these major global superpowers. It should be noted, though, that zombies still roam the globe. The Z War itself lasted about 10 years, too, meaning that the world has been at peace for about as long as it was at war. Max Brooks has been instructed by the chairperson of the United Nations Post-War Commission report to come up with a report containing just raw facts and data from the apocalyptic times. His initial report contained more than just raw data, however. It also included the human factor of emotions, which is not what the chairperson was looking for. After a debate with the chairperson ends up reducing the report to about half, removing all the human factor with the emotions. But Max Brooks was still left with all these interviews, and he felt that it should be justifiable to come up with his own book and his own account using these different interviews that he has, and he ends up writing a historic-type narrative using these interviews with different survivors. The fact that Max Brooks, as an author, writes this book with the intention of capturing past events is quite important in the argument that the book is strictly a science fiction book. Now, both science fiction and horror fall under a broader genre of speculative fiction. Speculative fiction is defined as a broad literary genre encompassing any fiction with supernatural, fantastical, or futuristic elements. Other types of notable genres that fall under this definition would be fantasy and dystopian literature. For the purposes of my argument, I will go ahead and stick to our class's definition of science fiction, which is the genre where artists develop a narrative based on the single premise that does not currently exist in reality. In other words, the author poses a what-if and bases his whole story around this. Or, in the words of Isaac Asimov, science fiction is the branch of literature that deals with the reaction of human beings to changes in science and technology. In World War Z, this change is a zombie apocalypse. Now, when it comes to horror literature, I like the way J.A. Cudden defines it best. He defines it as a piece of fiction which shocks or even frightens the reader. Now, when reading World War Z, readers might experience fear, but never fright or shock in the context of Cudden's definition. Now, here I must differentiate between fear and shock. Fear is a continuous or long-term emotion that one can experience, and fear is quite often overwhelming. For example, fear of being in debt, fear of having your heart broken. Now, shock or fright are emotions that are short-term and are caused by an unexpected stimulus, like an animal jumping out in the road while you're driving, or someone jumping out around a corner to scare you. Throughout the reading of World War Z, as a reader, I never experienced any fright. This is because Max Brooks, as the narrator of the story, is interviewing people about past events. When these interviewees are answering the questions the narrator poses for them, they have had 10 plus years to meditate upon them and move past what has happened to them. They no longer experience the fright or the shock when they're recalling the past events, so they never try to bring this shock or fright forward during the interview. The closest we really ever get to shock or fright is when Max Brooks is interviewing Sharon, who recalls her encounter with the zombies when she was younger in a church back in Topeka, Kansas, and the zombies came and took the church over. Now, Max Brooks has great intention for writing this book in the science fiction genre and not the horror narrative. Max Brooks wanted to fit other themes into his story that simply wouldn't fit using the horror genre as a platform. Instead, he uses the science fiction platform to critique different countries around the world and their responses to past events. He uses the zombie apocalypse trope to pose a challenge for the entire globe to take on, and then proceeds to guess how major superpowers would handle such a crisis. So, what are some of the critiques that Max Brooks brings forward? Well, in an interview with EatMyBrains.com, Max Brooks is asked a question about the research that he put in and how it seemed that he got the political agendas so correct with different countries and regions that would dictate their handling of the world in a zombie crisis scenario. So, how much of that research did that entail, and was he ever worried about offending any of the planet's more sensitive cultures? He responds with, he's never done this much research in his life. He wanted to get it right. He wanted to be as realistic as possible and break down some of the stereotypes that Americans have about other cultures. He says that he's a fanatical patriot, and he loves his country enough to admit that one of the flaws of the United States is isolationism. He wanted to combat that in World War Z and give the fellow Americans a window into the political and cultural workings of other nations. He wanted to base the stories on the historical actions of the countries in question. He does this quite excellently, I might add. Another theme that is recurrent in World War Z is that of radical extremism. In a radio interview, a caller calls in and tells Max, first of all, it was a great book. His question is, Max Brooks seems to draw a lot of parallels between today's war on terror methods and the methods used in the zombie war. How close, however, does Max compare the zombies to today's fundamental extremists, such as Al-Qaeda, these Muslim extremist groups? For example, they're unthinking, uncaring, they're irrational villains who kill for the sake of killing. Max Brooks responds to this caller by saying that the lack of rational thought has always scared him when it came to zombies. The idea that there is no middle ground, no room for negotiation. The zombies are simply there to take over and to kill. They don't cooperate with anyone, not even each other. That's always terrified Max Brooks. Of course, this also applies to terrorists, but it can apply to any crisis, such as a hurricane or a flu, pandemic, or the potential earthquake. Any kind of mindless extremism scares Max, and we're living in pretty extreme times, he also says. Another criticism that Max Brooks brings forward and is still relevant today is that critique about one of the greedy businessman trying to make a quick buck, along with American consumerism trends. Now, in World War Z, Max, as an interviewer, sits down in an interview with Breckenridge Scott, who just goes by Breck. Breck was a part of a group who created a vaccine for African rabies called Phalanx. Now, at first, when the Great Panic was going on, people referred to this zombie virus outbreak as African rabies. So, Breck and these people decided they would market a new vaccine for rabies, though it did not cure the zombie virus or prevent people from catching the zombie virus. Breck notes that it was important to sell a vaccine and not a cure because they were only trying to sell to people's fears. Fear sells, and that's all that they were doing. It made people feel safe. And because of this, the FDA was able to push it through quickly, and politicians got a lot of bonus points from their constituents. Breck defends himself for doing this. He knows that it didn't protect people against the zombie virus outbreak. It only cured or vaccinated people against rabies. He defends himself by saying that he shouldn't be blamed, that other people should be blamed. For example, the person who called it rabies in the first place, or the people who knew that the virus wasn't rabies, but decided to give the go-ahead on vaccination research for rabies anyways. Breck was only a marketer, I guess, in the sense of this group of people, and when it came to creating Phalanx. Breck also claims to have actually been a good guy. He helped jumpstart the economy, the United States economy, that is, because their vaccine brought money into the biomedical sector. And in turn, this growth in the biomedical sector helped jumpstart the economy. Phalanx is mentioned a couple times again later on in the book, but Brooks' critique on the American economy and consumerism isn't mentioned much again. Because of these different critiques that Max Brooks wanted to postulate about, the horror genre could not be a platform for Max Brooks to use and write about. He instead uses science fiction and the zombie apocalypse as the what if for his narrative. If the book was analyzed by a reader as a horror story, they would miss the different changes cultures undergo due to the zombie apocalypse. When this book is read, however, as a science fiction book, the reader can discover critiques of American isolationism, critiques of radical extremists, and the message about the global socio-economic structure that are still even held true to this day. In the end, fear is what sells.